Hey guys, if you still want to play a Sorcerer on the patch 1.1 on Diablo 4 in Endgame, this is the new Ice Shards build in order to farm in dungeon 60+. You'll see that it's still powerful, very fun and efficient to play in the endgame. For the skill you want to play the Ice Armor for the tankiness, the Teleport in order to pack enemies and to gain some mobility, Frost Nova to apply vulnerable and freezing, and Deep Freeze in order to be more tanky. It's important to play Deep Freeze since the patch 1.1, then we have Ice Shards, our DPS spell, and the Flame Shield for the immunity. For the enchantments you want the burning effect and the fact that you can trigger automatically Ice Shards on frozen enemies. For the gear you want the fact that you will spread your crowd control effect to enemies, packing enemies after you use teleport, and the frostburn in order to have a very good synergy with core effects. After you have damage reduction from crowd control enemies or vulnerable enemies, and this one increasing your lucky hit chance with barrier. For the weapon, critical strike chance when you have more than 100 mana on your core skill, and this one chance to pierce enemies with ice shards. Furthering some mana when you crowd control an enemy, and this one increasing damage to vulnerable when you have a barrier. Lastly, for the amulet, increase damage to stun or frozen enemies. For the gems, additional life, increase critical strike damage to vulnerable enemies, and skulls if you are not playing in ladder. Also, I put you in the builder the hearts that you should be playing for the season 1. For the stats on the ring, try to get some lucky hit chance and critical strike chance, and you can also get them on your offhand. Try to get on your boots additional ranks for your defensive abilities, and for the weapon, intelligence, vulnerable damage, critical strike damage, and so on. Now for the skill tree you want to put 1 point in Fireball in order to get the enchantment, and you can also put 1 point on Frostbolt if you lack mana against bosses. Then you have 5 points on Ice Shards with vulnerable and increased damage when you have more than 50 mana. You have the Flame Shield, the Teleport with the damage reduction, and the Ice Armor with additional barrier. You also have our Frost Nova with the vulnerable effect, the Glass Cannon, and just 1 point in the Elemental attunement. Then we have our lucky hit chance, 3 points on this one, the Mana Shield and the protection. You also want 3 points in order to increase barrier duration, and this one, even if it has been nerfed, it's still important to have the point on Devouring Blaze. A bit below you have the Cold passive, increase damage, also increase damage, and this one for the mana generation. Take the ultimate and 1 point here in order to increase your mana generation, and lastly Avalanche to increase your damage and to have no cost on casting a spell. For the Paragon, the first glyph increasing non-physical damage, you get through this and will have our first board with this passive. You want this glyph to increase damage to burning enemies, and this passive also increase damage to burning enemies, damage reduction from elites, and then we have the next board with this passive increasing your lucky hit chance. You get this glyph to increase damage after using a defensive skill, you have this passive for vulnerable damage, and we go get this one for damage reduction to vulnerable enemies. Here you have some life and mana, and this glyph damage to crowd control enemies. We won't be using this passive for the current duration. We have then increased non-physical damage, a glyph increased critical strike damage, and we have just this one for non-physical damage, damage to elite, and after we have our last board, we won't get this passive, also this passive here we won't take it. So lastly, you finish with this glyph, vulnerable damage, and this passive for damage to elites. I'll let you enjoy the gameplay, just keep in mind 2 things. The first one, if you want to go in a pack, make sure that you have your Flame Shield available. You can also, of course, use your ultimate if you need. The second one, bosses can be a bit hard to kill, so try to avoid hard bosses dungeons, but otherwise you shouldn't have any problem to farm in 60-65 dungeons. I hope that you like this build, and don't forget that you have our builds and guides on Diablo 4 on slashingcreeps.com.